Welcome to Qualified Opinions, where we test the ideas and limits, the knowns and known unknowns around freedom and order in contemporary politics and society. We invite you to listen as we engage with leading and emerging thinkers across disciplines and issues who will sharpen our thinking on the topics shaping our discourse. Welcome back. Last week, I talked with Michael Cannon about how we got into the healthcare mess we are in and why we should get the government out of it. Today, we're diving into the mess that is healthcare spending. It's the single largest item in the federal budget and the fastest growing one, too. It's the main driver of our future debt. As costs spiral out of control, it's clear that reform isn't just necessary, it's urgent. To help us chart a path forward, I'm joined by two of the sharpest minds in healthcare policy. First, I welcome back Michael Cannon. As a reminder, Michael is the Director of Health Policy Studies at the Cato Institute, but I'm also delighted to welcome Brian Blais. Brian is a former colleague at the Mercator Center, and after a stint at the White House, he's now the president and founder of Paragon Health Institute. Together, they'll help us chart a wish list for the Department of Efficiency about what to cut, what reforms to make, and bold ideas that can rein in spending while improving care for Americans. Welcome, guys.
Great to be back.
Great to be with you, Vero.
So, Brian, let me start with you. You started the Paragon Institute in 2021, and there was a very flattering article in the Washington Post recently. I'm going to read from it. It says, Paragon is at the center of Washington health policy conversations and potentially for the next 4 years as well. Blais, that's you, is helping shape the incoming Trump administration's priorities overseeing HHS policy planning for the transition team, according to people who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss confidential plans. Theo Merkel, another senior Paragon official, is also working on the transitions. So can you tell us about Paragon? Why did you think it was important to start it, and what do you guys do?
Hey, thanks, Vero, and it's great to be with you. You were probably my favorite colleague at the Mercator Center. Just a joy to work with and be around, and just a lovely human being. And Michael, it's great to be with Michael too. And I often say, one of the first books I read when I started my career in health policy was a book from Michael, Healthy Competition, which really shaped a lot of my thinking on problems with our health sector. And I coupled Michael's learning from Michael with Robin Hanson, who was my grad school professor in health economics. And that's when I decided to do my career in health policy. I worked in Congress, in the administration, at the National Economic Council, and at various think tanks. And the reality is, those of us who support free markets and limited government are vastly outgunned on health policy. And like you said, it's the most important area of domestic policy. It's 30% of the federal budget. Other than interest payments on the debt, it's the only part of the budget that's growing as a percentage of the economy. And we have just had a move over the past, really better part of the century, towards increased government centralization, control, rules, huge spending and subsidy programs. And there's a lot of great features of American healthcare, but we've got lots of inefficiency and waste. And, we really at Paragon, we think about two constituencies that are underrepresented in terms of health policy. One is the patient, and we think patients need to get much better value out of the healthcare sector. And there's a lot of things that happen to patients that don't improve their health outcomes. And the second is the American taxpayer. And the taxpayer pays for so much of these healthcare programs, and they're not getting a good return on their investment. So, in healthcare, you've got the industry, and they all have their lobbyists, whether it's the insurers, the hospitals, the physicians, the drug manufacturers. And then you've got sort of this left of center blob that, pushes a lot of just more government, more rules. We can't. There's so much paternalism in healthcare. There's more paternalism in health policy than really in other areas. And there was a huge void, and Paragon stepped in to avoid. And we do focus on policy wins. So what can we do to move the trajectory of health policy at the margin to expand individuals' healthcare freedom and reduce the problems that we have from our government programs?
Yeah, no, this is great. So, I mean, is this fair to say that I kind of Cato, you guys, try to think about what healthcare policy should look like in an ideal world, versus at Paragon, you try to be more practical. It's not that you're not guided by principles. Obviously, you are, but you're trying to kind of achieve like incremental improvements over this area.
So, I think the approach of the Cato Institute has always been that, trying to illustrate for people what a freer society would look like, what the benefits of that society would look like in terms of just people respecting the equal dignity of others, and the economic benefits from freer markets, and come just as a matter of course from respecting people's rights to make their own economic decisions, including in healthcare. And so to do that when it comes to healthcare, I talk about not just what's happening in healthcare right now and what's wrong with it, or particular policy ideas, reforms that would move it in the right direction, but also about the ultimate goal. Like, where do we want ultimately to be? And I think that's a world where everybody gets to make their own decisions when it comes to their health and their healthcare, which is everybody's first right when it comes to their healthcare. And I think most important right is to make their own health decisions. And so that means that I talk not only about reforms that are politically feasible today, but I try to develop reforms that move us in the direction of that ideal world that might not be politically feasible today, but we need to start talking about today so that we know the direction in which we should be heading, and so that policymakers become more comfortable with these ideas, and so that we can enact them at some point in the future. A good example is I did a paper a couple of years ago on what I think is the worst thing that the federal government does in healthcare, which was it created the income tax. And pretty much from the beginning of the income tax,
we talked about it last week.
Right. The federal government decided that it would not apply to income that you receive in the form of health insurance from your employer. And that right there, you wouldn't think that would have such a dramatic impact, but it has had a tremendous impact on the entire health sector and caused problems that the government has been trying to fix for the past 100 years, because government never goes back and undoes the problem that it created, or it just tries to put Band-Aids on top of it. Anyway, when I wrote that paper, the first recommendation I made was to eliminate the income tax. And I think that if you understand the damage that the income tax has done just in healthcare, that alone would justify eliminating the income tax. But of course, that's not politically feasible. The next best option, I think, is fundamental tax reform, where you replace the current income tax with something like a flat tax. That's not feasible right now. That's the second best. Well, the third best option would be to eliminate the tax exclusion for employer-sponsored health insurance. Even that's not feasible, because the fourth best option, which is capping that exclusion, Congress tried to do that and then repealed it. That's even the fourth best world is not politically feasible. So the fifth best that I proposed is an idea that I call universal health accounts. And I could talk about what that means, but it is a bow to political reality. And what I think is the best politically feasible option that we have for reforming the exclusion. So even while I talk about the ideal world, which is getting rid of the income tax, we also try to come up with what we think is the best politically feasible option and build support for that. Even if that feasibility isn't there today, it could become politically feasible in the future with more education and effort on our part.
So you, Brian, how do you guys think about when you're thinking about reforms, your approach is different than Michael's. So how do you go about it? Just to think about it. What's the philosophy that guides your decisions and what you tackle and the list of cuts you make?
So I can tell you on the exclusion. So Paragon, I co-authored a paper this year with my colleague Theo Merkel, Follow the Money, How Tax Policy Affects Healthcare. And you have to write about the exclusion, right? It's the primary way that tax policy affects healthcare. And we need to make a recommendation on that. We couldn't just leave. The exclusion has lots of distortions in it. I agree with Michael on the economics of the exclusion. So Paragon's approach was Michael's fourth best solution. We proposed capping the exclusion, which is, I can tell you, that's a major recommendation for Paragon to make. And we got lots of pushback for making that recommendation, both from the business community that got very upset that Paragon would put out that recommendation, as well as folks on like conservatives that think that employer-sponsored insurance is the bulwark against single payer. But it was something that we felt like we had to sort of be intellectually honest. We needed to put out that the best sort of free market policy here would be a cap on the exclusion.
Yeah, can we just for a second? So can you tell me how much the scale of the exclusion? I know Michael doesn't like the word tax expenditures, like it's a preferential treatment. How much are we talking about of a discrepancy compared to other income, I guess? So for healthcare spending.
So when we say the exclusion, like the employer, the premiums are not subject to federal income or payroll tax, and then they're generally not subject to state tax either. The government loses revenue on that. So that's why some people refer to it as a tax expenditure. Mm-hmm. The estimates of the loss to the federal government from the exclusion, I think, are about $350 billion a year now.
Closer to $400 billion.
And when it's all premiums, it's all government. It's all business plans or like healthcare.
So if you get health insurance from an employer, every dollar that the employer spends on that health insurance is a dollar that comes out of your other wages or benefits, and completely, as Brian says, completely avoids income and payroll taxes. Any money that you pay toward that premium directly also avoids those income and payroll taxes. And then there are other categories of tax-free health benefits that also avoid income and payroll taxes, and some that only avoid income, like money that you or your employer put into a tax-free health savings account, or that your employer puts into a flexible spending arrangement, or money that your employer pays toward your medical bills through a health reimbursement arrangement. All of these things are tax-free. When your employer does it, they avoid both income and payroll taxes. If you put money in the HSA by yourself, you might have to pay payroll taxes on it, but not income. And it's important to understand the revenue loss that Brian mentioned. It's $350 to $400 billion per year, because that money avoids what is an average marginal tax rate of about 33%. And so that means the federal government collects less revenue. But I think the more important figure to focus on when it comes to the exclusion is that the money that comes out of your salary and that your employer then gets to control and use to choose and pay for your health insurance is about $1.2 trillion per year. That's a lot more than that revenue loss of the federal government. It's about 3 times as much. And that is a huge chunk of workers' earnings that the employer gets to control because of federal tax policy. And you mentioned before that healthcare is the largest item in the federal budget. In 2024, federal health spending was almost $1.6 trillion, 1.5 or 1.6. And this amount of money that we're talking about that employers get to control is almost that big. It's $1.2 trillion, and so it rivals or comes close to total federal health spending on all healthcare programs, Medicare, Medicaid, the Veterans Health Administration, Indian Health Service, all of it.
Yeah,
all of it. So this is a huge policy, and with tremendous impact on that.
Can we? So we all agree that, I mean, this, in a way, this should be a top priority of reform for healthcare, right?
Agreed.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's not politically feasible in the near term. So, and I was pretty critical when Congress repealed the Cadillac tax, and I wrote about this starting when they weakened it and delayed it when I was Mercatus.
So the Cadillac tax was a tax on gold plans, isn't that what it was? I can't remember.
It was a
something
provision
like that
in Obamacare that was a 40% excise tax on the value of employer premiums above a certain threshold. So it was like maybe $20,000 to start, and then it was indexed to inflation. I thought it was one of the best parts of Obamacare, along with the Medicare cuts in Obamacare. And I did my first Wall Street Journal editorial when I left the White House that Congress should not repeal the Cadillac tax. They should replace it. And then Congress voted with over 400 members of the House and over 90 members of the Senate to repeal the Cadillac tax. Isn't
a better way, though? I mean, I rather than have kind of a tax, I mean, wouldn't capping the tax exemption, like the tax expenditure, sorry, Michael, the tax expenditure would do the same thing in theory, right?
It would. And in fact, they created this Cadillac tax to mimic that exact effect.
Yeah.
Do that exact thing, to cap the exclusion so that the premiums, your premiums would be, you would exclude them from income and payroll taxes up to, say, $12,000 or $15,000 in premiums. And if your premiums exceeded $15,000, then you would pay income and payroll taxes on everything above that. So if you cap the exclusion, that's how that would work. Or if you create a Cadillac tax, as Congress did, and slap a 40% tax rate on your premiums in excess of $15,000, and it wasn't exactly that, there's a formula, then you get basically the same effect. And it's really funny why they went with the approach that they did. It was because people would recognize capping the exclusion as a tax on the worker. But if you levy a 40%, quote, Cadillac tax on the insurance company, well, they're going to pass that right through to the worker. So it's economically equivalent. But everybody thinks that it's a tax on insurance companies and not on the worker. And that's why it was able to get through. But people figured out that it was really a tax on them, and the employers and the insurance companies went to Congress and lobbied to them to repeal it. So they repealed it without it ever taking effect because it didn't have any natural constituency that would support keeping it. Yeah. And so the answer to your question is, it's exactly the same.
But I mean, I see the point with like for you, Brian, like trying to be practical. You're thinking, okay, we can't let this tax expenditure just explode, which it will, because government intervention and the subsidies of healthcare through government means that prices are going to go up, and hence the exclusion, if not capped, one way or another, is gonna go up. And if capping it is impossible, I can see why, you're trying to kind of restrict it other ways. But it really tells me that kind of this, while it's politically impractical, like it's politically unfeasible to really, it seems like an incredible priority. Michael, you and I have talked about it last week, but I also, one of the big problem I see with the exclusion is like, ultimately, it creates a bias towards paying people in fringe benefits. And that means that it actually slows the growth of wages. And it also is an imposition of the mix, the what your total compensation looks like. Effectively, you create a bias for compensation to look a certain way so that all the people who'd rather be paid exclusively in cash with wages, are losing. And it just kind of, it's so frustrating because it is like a problem that's staring you in the face that is creating so many of the problems that people complain about. And yet it just extremely hard to go, to reform it.
That's right. And it's a problem that you see with every tax system that I'm aware of, which is when you create a tax, levy a tax on something, some economic activity, whatever, there's always lobbying to narrow the base, exempt my thing from the tax, exempt this thing that I like or that my constituents like from the tax. You can see it not just throughout the income tax code at the federal level, but also state sales taxes. They exempt food and all sorts of things. And the capital gains tax. There's a capital gains tax, but it doesn't apply on owner-occupied homes, or at least not up to this amount. And then there are other ways that people are always trying to get the tax to apply to other people and not to them. And then once you create these special tax preferences or differential tax treat where you narrow the base, it's really, really hard to get rid of them. And it's really, really hard to get rid of this tax exclusion because it effectively forces, and we should be clear, it's not the exclusion that forces that $1 trillion people to spend that $1 trillion on health insurance and healthcare. It's really the threat of the income tax itself. Mm-hmm. So I don't want to blame and we always do this. We should be more careful with language. The exclusion is where government leaves people alone, and that doesn't distort things. What distorts things is where government taxes over here or all this other income. It effectively penalizes people for spending their money on things other than health insurance. But what it does is that implicit but very real penalty forces people to spend $1.2 trillion of their earnings per year on health insurance, and it also gives advantages to large employers over small employers. And the health sector and large employers will just fight like mad to eliminate any attempt to eliminate or even reform that idea, which is what happened to the Cadillac tax. As I said, there's no natural constituency, and so lobbying by large employers and the insurance industry got rid of it. It was almost unanimous, if I recall correctly, Brian. I mean, there was almost no support for keeping it.
Healthcare economists.
Well, yeah, but they don't have as much sway as we would like them. And some days that's a good thing. So, but if you looked at, I think this is an area where I may be able to claim that between Brian and me, I think I can make a good argument that my approach to the exclusion might be more practical than Brian's. So I think that what Brian has done in advocating capping the exclusion is right and brave, and if he's taking heat from erstwhile allies or anyone for that, we should be reminding those people that actually he's taking the right position. So that's a very, very brave thing. But the political dynamics surrounding the issue are such that because there's no natural constituency to protect it, that might not be a very practical option for trying to reform the exclusion. Whereas if you reform the exclusion in a way that ties immediate benefits to a large constituency of people, then those people could fight back against the industry and help to protect reform. And that's what I've tried to do when I'm trying to reform the exclusion, come up with ways to reform the exclusion.
Let me make one comment on the exclusion and try to move us to, spent a lot of time on the exclusion. We're talking about Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare.
Yeah, and I also want to wrap that conversation. I want you guys to say, if you guys were in front of the Doge guys, right? You're in front of the Doge bros, and you want to tell them what they should do with the exclusion in one sentence. What would you do? So, Brian, go ahead with your comments, and then how would you advise them?
I mean, I would tell them that the exclusion should be taken up in comprehensive tax reform. And if we're going to they took on the mortgage interest rate deduction in 2017, right? They increased the standard deduction and got rid, for the most part, mortgage interest rate deduction. So now the exclusion is by far the biggest preferential tax item. I'd say, because you need to have a trade-off here. The trade-off should be you're going to lower marginal tax rates.
And that's a pay for. That's a pay for
yes.
all the rest.
So, I mean, that's how you want to do. I mean, generally, that is tax reform, is get rid of all these special things in the tax code and lower marginal tax rates. So I would say, and this is, I'd say cap the exclusion at, I think in the Paragon paper, we put it at the 75th percentile and then use it to lower rates. I want to make this thing on the practical nature of Paragon. Like I would say when we look at things, there's like two tests. What's the best policy position? So Michael gave five options on how to deal with the exclusion. There's lots of options for how to deal with problems. So figure out what those options are and what the economic benefit is of those. And then you've got to do the other thing though, which is, all right, what's the likelihood that if we take that approach and really push it, that we're going to be successful? So you've got to sort of marry the things that are economically most optimal with the things that have the most political chance of success. Paragon, really, a lot of what we've put out on Medicare and Medicaid reform and the ACA, like we say it's practical, but it'd be a lot of work to get there. Yeah. I mean, we're like pushing the bounds of what's achievable. And in some ways, that is because it's a Republican versus Democrat issue. And conservatives feel one way about it, liberals feel the other way about it. And it's just, you have a partisan divide. There's a whole bunch of other issues in healthcare, though, where it's really like the policy community against the special interests and the industry. And so, I mean, there's a mix. In Paragon, we work on both sets of those issues. And it's important to work on both sets of those issues. And it lends to different coalitions. Like on some things, I'm aligned with the Brookings Institution. Like they endorsed our Medicare Advantage reform proposal, our site neutral payments in Medicare. Like we can work with folks on the left on that. Policies that we have on Obamacare and like ending the enhanced subsidies, which I know we'll talk about, that's a different calculus. And both of those are very hard battles to win.
So let's talk about spending now. So first, maybe Brian, I'll start with you. Can you kind of give us an idea of how much the government spends altogether on healthcare, and big bucket categories on what we pay out there?
So the big three are Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare. So Medicare, I think the federal part of Medicare spending is between $800 and $900 billion a year, and that is projected to rapidly escalate, mostly because of the aging of the baby boomers. So Medicare is number one. The second is Medicaid. Medicaid is a joint federal-state program, ostensibly for lower-income Americans, but it is really gone into in many states, and for services like long-term care, it's an entitlement now that reaches well into the middle, if not upper class. The federal spending on Medicaid is now over $600 billion a year. And then you've got the Obamacare subsidies, and the big expenditure there are premium subsidies that the federal government sends directly to health insurance companies. That was relatively small through 2019 because the exchanges were so much less popular than expected. But in both the American Rescue Plan Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, the Democrats significantly increased the size of the subsidies, and the cost has exploded. So it's now approaching, I think, $130, $140 billion a year. So in total, I think Michael said this, it's like $1.5 to $1.6 trillion in federal health expenditures.
And the Obamacare subsidies, they're done through the premium tax credit, or is there more? And is this done it's listed on the tax expenditure list? Is it how
part of it is, but it's not really a tax credit at all. It's just government spending.
So, and it's mostly like there's the refundable versus non-refundable side. Most of the cost is just government spending because most of the enrollees don't have enough tax liability to offset the tax liability. So like 80% of the cost is just federal spending.
Yeah.
But the other 20% is still money that you send to the IRS, and then the IRS sends it to your insurance company, and they call it a non-refundable tax credit.
Yeah. Yeah, it's crazy. So let's start with spending. Think about you're having a meeting, the two of you, you're having a meeting with Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy's team. And what do you start with?
I would start by saying that the entire conversation that we've been having in Washington, D.C. about fiscal responsibility, about eliminating the federal deficit and buying down federal debt is completely detached from reality, because no one is talking about the magnitude of cuts that we need to enact to get to fiscal responsibility. In 2025, the Medicare, Medicaid, Obamacare, CHIP program, federal health spending is going to be about $1.7 trillion, all in, $1.7 trillion. The deficit will be about $1.9 trillion. And as Brian said, health spending is, as we mentioned before, federal health program, it's more than almost twice as much as defense spending. It's more than Social Security. You cannot get to balance without cutting health spending. And yet no one is talking about the sorts of cuts that we would need to get there. So, and that's the bad news. But the good news is that there is so much waste in these programs that there's a lot that federal policymakers can cut without harming the health outcomes, the overall health outcomes of the populations in these programs. You can cut the Medicare program. The best research suggests that a third of Medicare spending doesn't do anything to make enrollees healthier or happier, which suggests you can cut a third from that program without affecting overall enrollee health.
I think it's worth repeating this, right? I mean, like I was surprised and not surprised at the same time when I read in your note to Doge, the best available data suggests 1/3 of Medicare spending is pure waste, and basically you could cut it without affecting overall health. And that's kind of one of the things that seems to be really lost from the debate, is that we're talking about government spending, but we're tying it to how much it costs, health insurance cost, but we're very rarely tying it to health outcomes.
And when you subsidize something, as the government subsidizes healthcare heavily, you get more of it. And healthcare is different from the rest of the economy in a number of ways. But one of the ways that it's similar to all other goods and services is that beyond a certain point, it stops providing benefit. So if you go to the doctor once a year, that might provide you some benefit. But if you go 365 times a year, at some point, those extra doctor visits are not helping you. Or the extra hospitalizations that people in Manhattan get versus people in Portland, Oregon. Some of those extra hospitalizations are not improving their health. And researchers who have looked into this found that low or zero value stuff accounts for about 1 out of every $3 that Medicare spends. So that suggests you can cut the program by 1/3 and not affect overall health outcomes for seniors. So that's the magnitude of cuts that we should be discussing when it comes to the Medicare program.
Can you give a few examples of the stuff we could cut without affecting health outcome?
I did. The way researchers came up with that number was they looked at parts of the country where enrollees spend more money on healthcare. Medicare spends more money on its enrollees than in other areas of the country. The example people like to use is Medicare enrollees in Miami might spend twice as much or use twice as many services as Medicare enrollees in Minneapolis. And those extra services are not making them healthier. So those extra services are an extra trip to the cardiologist or this other specialist per year, or a hospitalization when they didn't need to go into the hospital. And if they were living in Minneapolis, the doctor would not have admitted them to the hospital, or the length of the hospital, and so on. So if you can get the people in Miami to start practicing medicine more like they do in Minnesota, then you can reduce Medicare spending by a third, and all that extra stuff wasn't making the patients any healthier or happier with the care that they were getting. And so it's not going to result in a reduction in the overall health of the Medicare population. Now, how you go about that is a subject of some dispute. How do you implement those cuts? I would recommend letting the enrollees make those decisions themselves by giving them, and this is the Medicare reform part of the recommendations I made to the DOJ, giving Medicare, that remaining 2/3 of Medicare spending, to Medicare enrollees as a cash payment, where low-income people and people with higher disease burdens get a bigger check from Medicare than wealthy and healthy people do. And then let them make those rationing decisions themselves, and they will do as well as they did when they were spending the government's money willy-nilly. And you have to make similar sorts of cuts to the Medicaid program and the CHIP program and to Obamacare if you want to get to balance. Everyone is talking about Donald Trump in the campaign pretended like he could get to balance without touching Medicare. And that's just not possible. I'm glad that he did not say no to Medicaid cuts, but he also has to look at the Medicare program.
Brian.
So I had Paul Winfrey do a paper for Paragon last year, and Paul he's now the president of Epic. He was in the White House in 2017. He's an empirical economist. And so he looked at the federal programs and the growth trajectory of federal programs and the ability with incoming revenue to pay for those federal programs, and something called fiscal space, which I'm not going to get into. But basically, it's a measure of the federal government's borrowing capacity. And Paul estimated that we need to reduce federal spending by 7.5% off of baseline over the next decade. So that amount is about $1.7 trillion. So my goal is to enact policy changes that reduce federal health spending by $1.7 trillion. So that's the budget that I'm putting out. That does not reach balance. I'll be clear. Our goal is not to reach balance.
Yeah.
It is basically to stabilize the federal debt as a percentage of GDP. I think there's three main areas. First, I should say is policymakers should do no harm. The number one thing I am talking to policymakers about now is letting the expanded Obamacare subsidies expire after 2025. Do not make the fiscal situation worse by continuing those subsidies to health insurance companies. They're very expensive. They've been loaded with fraud. And Paragon, really the
20 million. Didn't you say $20 billion a year in fraud just this year? Yeah.
Yes, because they made the coverage fully subsidized for individuals in a certain income range, but there's not good eligibility verification. So a lot more people are getting this full subsidies to cover the entire cost of the program. So then they capped the recovery, right? Yes. So if you get too much subsidy, so again, the way this works is people estimate their income. Their subsidy is based on their estimated income. The subsidy then goes directly from the Treasury to the health insurance company. If at the end of the year, when the person's actual income is known, then the actual subsidy that they were entitled to is known. If the person got too much subsidy, meaning the insurer got too much subsidy, there are severe limits. In many cases, the federal government can't recover any of it. So you produce incentives throughout the system for insurers, for applicants to miss state income because they get far more enrollees. And insurers, and this is one of the problems with healthcare, is that a lot of the healthcare industry has gotten used to getting their revenue from the federal government. And it's much easier to get your revenue from the federal government than having to provide value to a customer, serve them well, and get revenue from them. So increasing part of the revenue is coming from the federal government. So insurers benefit, and then brokers have an incentive to miss state income, because if they get these individuals to enroll, and oftentimes they're enrolling people without their consent, they get a monthly check for every month that the individual is enrolled in the plan. So you've got what the Biden administration has allowed to happen over the last couple of years with these expanded subsidies and with the lack of eligibility verification is just a massive amount of waste, fraud, and abuse in the exchanges. And the remedy for that, there's a couple remedies. The Trump administration could take steps to actually enforce the law and verify income, but these expanded subsidies need to expire. So don't make the problem worse, right? So much of they can't make the problem worse because the problem that they have is so significant. In terms of this sort of three main areas, we oversubsidize insurers, we oversubsidize hospitals, and we oversubsidize states. So in terms of insurers, Paragon put out an MA reform paper that would address many of the problems with how MA works.
MA?
Medicare Advantage. The big problem that most people are familiar with is on risk adjustment, and the Wall Street Journal and New York Times have done several pieces on risk adjustment. And basically, the insurers get paid more the sicker they make their enrollees appear. So they have significant incentives to make their enrollees seem very sick. It's a massive problem. It's really abused by some of the bigger insurers in the country. United Healthcare is a big abuser of coding intensity. And so we have a proposal that would that would improve the integrity of the risk adjustment program. We have a comprehensive Medicare Advantage reform proposal that recognizes that there are some benefits of Medicare Advantage, but quite frankly, there's excessive subsidies, and we need to reduce the subsidies. We oversubsidize hospitals. Michael and I, we talk about site-neutral payments, but one of the things that Medicare does is if the exact same service is provided in a hospital as in a physician's office, Medicare pays much more for the service if it's provided in a hospital. That doesn't help beneficiaries. It actually hurts beneficiaries because the amount that people pay for their cost sharing is a function of the total bill. So if they get it in the hospital and the hospital receives a higher rate for Medicare, the senior has to pay more. So there's something called site-neutral payments that would lower what hospitals receive to what doctors receive.
Yeah, and I've seen estimates of savings over 10 years, and it's enormous. It's almost like $100 billion just for that reform.
Yeah, it could be more than that, depending on how aggressive you go. The one I'm most passionate about is how much we oversubsidize states through Medicaid. Yeah. So states now get more money from the federal government than they raise from the state tax base. And 60% of all money that Washington sends to states goes through Medicaid. The problem is the federal government provides an open-ended reimbursement of state Medicaid expenditures. That by itself is a problem. Like the more money states spend, the more money Washington spends. But the real, to make this problem even more grotesque, the state doesn't have to actually spend the money. They can create, through all these accounting schemes and gimmicks, fake expenditures and then submit the bill to the Department of Health and Human Services. And they get a large portion of that fake expenditure reimbursed. So the classic example is something called Medicaid provider taxes. The way this works is the state will take a hospital and say, we're going to tax you $1 million. So the hospital transfers the $1 million to the state. The state then takes that $1 million and makes a Medicaid expenditure on the hospital. The state then submits that for reimbursement. And the average state has a 65% reimbursement rate. So they get $650,000 from the federal government for an accounting gimmick. And the state can use that on that provider, on other providers for whatever they want. It really bastardizes the way that the Medicaid program was supposed to work. And it creates enormous waste and abuse in the Medicaid program. Medicaid is the highest improper payment rate of any major government program.
It's over $50 billion a year, right? That we know of.
In 2020, it was $100 billion on the federal side. And then they started giving COVID flexibilities. So the improper payment rate doesn't mean anything anymore because of the way CMS has manipulated it over the last couple of years. But we think President Biden called provider taxes a scam when he was vice president and advocated for their elimination. Like there's a whole bunch of like just good government. Like government shouldn't work like this.
No.
And it's not even a healthcare issue. It's really just this is like this crazy fiscal issue between the federal government and states, where we just let the states rip off the federal government, and then the states often do they do expansionary fiscal policy at the state level because they're getting so much cash from Washington through the Medicaid mechanism.
I mean, for a lot of states, right? So you're saying that this is something I hadn't heard. I knew that for many states, federal government reimbursement for Medicaid was the biggest part of their budget. I mean, they were just basically that's of their revenue effectively, and but also of their spending. Right, Medicaid is becoming like the biggest budget item. But I didn't know that actually really they were getting more from the federal government than they were getting from their state tax base, and that's just that is messed up. Like from like an incentive perspective, from a principles perspective, from a federalism perspective, from all of this, it's insane.
Yeah, Paul Winfrey told me that he thinks the last year, and I'm doing this from memory, so apologies if I get this wrong by a year or two, but I think it was 2013. 2013 was the last year that states collected more from state taxpayers than they got in federal transfers.
Yeah, it's messed up. So practical question, like political, I guess. What do you guys think could happen? Are we more likely to kind of get a Medicaid reform if people understand that this is not that you're cutting healthcare for poor people, but what we're really effectively doing is stopping the sham from and the budget gimmicks from hospitals, or do we have any shot at Medicare spending cuts?
So there's a reason that Donald Trump, during the campaign, said that he's open to cutting, it said he isn't open to cutting Medicare, but did not say the same thing about Medicaid. Medicare is the federal program that covers the elderly and disabled, and those folks tend to vote in much greater numbers than the low-income people for which the Medicaid program ostensibly exists and whom it serves. And so it is much easier to cut the Medicaid program than it is to cut Medicare, because the backlash is not from voters is not as great. Might be as great from the healthcare industry, because both of them spend about $1 trillion per year lavishing subsidies on the industry. So when the cuts come, and they will come, the Congress can't keep spending the money the way that it is. And if something cannot go on forever, eventually it must stop. When the cuts come, they're going to hit Medicaid first. And that's going to put a lot of people, already very vulnerable people, in an even more vulnerable position, because the government won't pull the rug out from underneath them. That's one of the reasons Brian and I support reforms that would make more stable forms of health insurance available to low-income people. Health insurance, it doesn't disappear just because government finally hit the wall and has to start making cuts. But like I said, you can't get there just by cutting Medicaid. You also have to cut Medicare. But there is one other reason why it might be okay, or that cutting Medicaid is not going to be as bad as you might think. And that is that if Congress cuts Medicaid by, say, $100 billion per year, there is no reason or no single person on Medicaid has to lose their eligibility. No single person on Medicaid has to lose any benefits, optional or mandatory, as we call them in healthcare wonk land. And there's no reason that states have to reduce a single payment that they make to a single healthcare provider. Because even if Congress reduces Medicaid spending by $100 billion, states can make up that $100 billion. States have taxing authority. most people talk about Medicaid, who talk about Medicaid, act like they don't know this. Like they don't realize that if Congress cuts $1 of Medicaid spending, the states can make up that dollar just by increasing taxes. They can do that. Not a single person has to lose their Medicaid coverage. But people are afraid that states won't do that. And it's important to understand what that means. If states won't make up those spending cuts by increasing taxes on their own residents to pay for Medicaid programs, to keep the Medicaid programs they have right now, what that means is that the Medicaid programs they have right now are not popular in the states. It means that the taxpayers in those states, if they had to bear the cost of those programs, would not do it. And that means we should be cutting those programs yesterday, because this is a democracy and we shouldn't be foisting on people programs that are unpopular among voters. So that is actually, if you think that states are not going to make up those spending cuts, that's another reason to make those spending cuts, because it means that the current Medicaid program is much larger than voters actually want it to be.
Or they may be willing to increase the taxes if Congress restore the state and local tax deduction, right?
So perhaps, but that's not a good reason to restore the state and local tax deduction.
Yeah. No, I agree.
What we need to fundamentally think about is how to improve incentives, right? So who bears the cost and who's making these decisions? And Medicaid, when the federal government is paying the vast majority of the bill, and at a significant percentage rate, right? States don't have good incentives. So there are a variety of ways you can improve incentives for states to get more value from the money. One, I mean, a classic conservative idea on Medicaid, which I fully support, is block grants to the program. Mm-hmm. Right? You figure out, all right, here's what the federal budget is. You then send states that money, and it's for certain categories of lower income Americans, and then states develop the programs, but anything that they spend above the federal contribution, the state fully bears the burden on. So you've profoundly improved the incentive to get value. Let me give you one other Medicaid.
And you kept the growth, right? You kept the growth of the Medicare
of the Medicaid yes.
Well, that's an interesting question.
Can I get?
Please go. Go ahead.
So the other Medicaid policy that I really want to talk about is, and this is a major distortion, and because of Obamacare, they put in a much higher federal reimbursement rate for the able-bodied working age Obamacare expansion population. So it started at 100%. It's now 90%. It's scheduled to be 90% in perpetuity. So states spend $100 on the expansion population, $90 comes from Washington. For the regular enrollees, it's much lower. There's no sensible, rational construct that the federal government should pay more for able-bodied expansion enrollees than traditional enrollees, who are children, people with disabilities, and seniors. Paragon has a policy proposal that would phase down that 90% match rate until it equals the standard match rate within each state. Now, there's some other aspects.
Can you explain this? Can you go back there? What's the difference between those who come through the expansion versus those who are the regular? Can you give us an example?
Yes. So traditional Medicaid enrollees were certain categories. So if you're a child in a low income family, right, you're eligible for Medicaid. If you're on supplemental security income, the SSI program, you're eligible for Medicaid. If you're a low income senior who's on Medicare, you can get Medicaid coverage to pay for certain things that Medicare doesn't cover. And then for like pregnant women, there's eligibility for pregnant women that would be on Medicaid. So those are like the classic categories of Medicaid enrollees. Okay. Policy over the last 25, 30 years has expanded Medicaid. Like most of the growth in, if you look at the ways Americans get insurance, huge increase in Medicaid enrollment. 35 years ago, there were 2 times as many people in poverty in the U.S. as on Medicaid. Now, we have twice as many people on Medicaid as live in poverty. So the Medicaid eligibility has just expanded significantly.
Like, by the way, this is the problem with pretty much every government spending. You look the expansion in eligibility for food stamps. You look at for pretty much everything. That is effectively where the growth in spending.
Another thing, actually, one of the things I would tell Doge, like I think it was a pretty practical recommendation, Vero, is we need to do frequent eligibility reviews. Like a lot of these people, they gain income, they then have like other types of coverage, but they're still enrolled in the Medicaid program because no one has an incentive for them to come off. The insurer's making money, the state is spending with federal dollars. Like we need to do more frequent reviews of eligibility for all of the means tested programs. So Obamacare came in and created so able-bodied working age adults and created a much higher reimbursement rate. Now it did that because it needed to get states to expand. We are now, Obamacare passed almost 15 years ago. It makes no sense to have two different rates. So our proposal would take the 90% FMAP, and for a state like New York, which is a 50% FMAP, over a decade, it would lower the 90% to 50%. We estimate that proposal would save the federal government about $550 billion. And most of it is what Michael said. You are just going to states and saying, look, we're going to reimburse you the same percentage that you get for your other enrollees on the program. And then states will have to decide whether it's valuable to continue the expansion, receiving, a lower reimbursement rate, but still, a significant federal contribution to that population.
I have a question. Could state decide, and let's imagine you get your way, and the expanded population on Medicaid, the states get a lower reimbursement rate from the federal government. Could it be that the states, one of the reform that they do is to say, you know what, actually, we're going to revamp eligibility and just basically kick out a lot of people from Medicaid who we think just shouldn't be on Medicaid, and go further than basically what Obamacare, however Obamacare designed the program. Do the states still have the freedom to do things like this, or are their hands totally tied if they want to get any of the money from the federal government?
So they have the freedom to opt out of the Medicaid program entirely. They could say, we're not going to run a federal Medicaid program anymore, and we don't want your federal money anymore. So in theory, or legally speaking, they have the freedom to do that. But as Brian said, if the main source of your state revenue is government transfer, the biggest one of those is the Medicaid program, then it is politically infeasible to do that because you're talking about eliminating, how much economic activity, how many jobs in your state. And that's why both Brian and I, even though I support a constitutional amendment banning intergovernmental transfers from the federal government to the states or any other levels of government.
So do I.
Because they're so inherently corrupting. We both make these bows to political reality where we say, all right, don't eliminate them all right now. Let's change the formula or cap the amount or turn it into a block grant so that we can get rid of just some of the perverse incentives and corruption. But if they are taking the money, if they continue to take the money, and it's very hard for them to say no to it, then there are all sorts of rules that come along with taking that money. They have to enroll certain people. They have to provide them certain benefits. And there are even tests on whether the prices they set for those services that they're subsidizing are adequate to give people the access that Medicaid promises them. And there's very little flexibility for sensible sorts of reforms like requiring able-bodied adults who are on the Medicaid program to work. That's a big fight that's been happening at the federal level for some time. It's a pretty sensible reform. Obamacare opened the program to able-bodied working age adults. It's not unreasonable to ask them to work if they are able to do so. But my read of federal law, there have been some creative interpretations of federal law here. My read of federal law says that it does not allow states to impose that sort of requirement. States that have tried to have had them knocked down in court, you would need an act of Congress, to give states that flexibility in the Medicaid program.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's kind of crazy. And it's also, I mean, if I remember the Oregon study, again, I follow this from a big distance. One of the things that it showed, right, is while with the extension of Obamacare, people felt good about Medicaid, it didn't actually change the mortality. Am I right about this? Do I remember
Well,
this
it wasn't
correctly?
powered enough. The good news is, so this is a randomized controlled study of people who got Medicaid versus nothing in Oregon. And those people were the most vulnerable parts of the Obamacare Medicaid expansion. This happened before Obamacare. They were people making under 100% of the federal poverty level, which today is about $15,000. Obamacare opens the program up to make people, single adults making about $21,000 per year. And among that vulnerable population, it's randomly assigned some people to get Medicaid, some people to get nothing. And fortunately, the underlying mortality rates in that population were not great enough. They were not large enough that and the effect of Medicaid on mortality was not great enough that they were able to find some statistically discernible difference in mortality rates between the people who got Medicaid and the people who didn't. But they were able to get reliable data on people who got Medicaid and the difference in their cholesterol levels and their hypertension control and their blood sugar levels versus people who did not get Medicaid, and they were no better. So there was no improvement in measured physical health outcomes for the people who got Medicaid in the Oregon program. This is Brian and I have cited that program so many times when we argued as states they should not be expanding their Medicaid programs because we don't even know what we're getting for the money. We're not sure that it's making those people healthier. We have the most reliable data say that it is not making them healthier.
Yeah. I have a final question for you guys. Regulation. One of the things that makes reforming Medicare and Medicaid so difficult compared to Social Security, where it's a pure financing, cut the spending, kind of figure out how to cut it. What it makes so hard is that it's not just a spending program. It's really just, it's a big regulatory mess, really. I mean, it starts with regulation. It kind of interferes at every step of the healthcare provider and patients and insurance. So same thing, Brian, like if you're like, what's your priority on the regulatory front, where that I think there's some bipartisan excitement about doing stuff on regulation. So,
I mean, it's a good question to end on, Vero. It's an important question. In Medicare, if your listeners are familiar with Econ 101 and the problem with government price controls, right? Our healthcare sector is driven by government price controls. Medicare decides, CMS decides what Medicare is going to reimburse and what the payment rate is going to be. And what's worse about that's bad enough because Medicare is so big, but private insurers they amplify Medicare's price controls because most of their contracting with providers is a function of what Medicare determines. So it makes it very hard for innovators who want to break through, startups, to get business plans developed because they've got to have a huge political strategy in getting Medicare to reimburse their product at a price point that they want. So that's a big problem. On the non-government side, Obamacare is a big problem because Obamacare creates a set of requirements around what health insurance must look like. And we need dynamism and entrepreneurship in how we pay for healthcare. And so Obamacare put a straitjacket on the industry. So what we tried to do is open up options to Obamacare, like short-term plans or something that Michael has written about probably more than anybody. But that's a alternative to Obamacare that is not regulated by the federal government, and that there's an option there to have some of the innovative coverage through that. And then ways we could try to loosen the Medicare price control regime. There was a hope that Medicare Advantage would do some of that. I've been underwhelmed with what Medicare Advantage has done to in that capacity. But it really should be like we should, conservatives, libertarians, that should be one of our like main things in healthcare is just deregulate as much as possible and as aggressively as possible.
Michael?
There's an important difference between rules that the government attaches to subsidies that it offers to people, like through the Medicaid program, and government regulation. So when the government says you may not charge a price higher than X, that's a price control. But when the government says we will not pay a price higher than X, that's not a price control. That's a bid. The government's a purchaser. The fact that they doesn't want to pay more than X doesn't stop you from going outside of the Medicare program and charging or paying more than X for that good or service. It just means the government's not going to do it. And that's a really important distinction because the industry loves to blur that distinction and say the government is imposing price controls on us by not giving us the price that we want. And when it does that, it is able to convince a lot of free market advocates or limited government advocates that really the right thing to do to limit government is to increase government spending. And that's what's happening right now in this fight over Medicare's, the prices Medicare pays for prescription drugs. It is the Republicans, the limited government party that is trying to keep Medicare's drug prices high. And it's the Democrats, the party of big government, that is trying to reduce Medicare spending on prescription drugs. And there are arguments that the right makes to say, it'll kill innovation and all that. And we can address those. But there's a very real danger if we don't distinguish between conditions on government spending and regulation, that we'll all just end up being cronyists and carrying water for the industry that is making lots of money off of big government. There are lots of things that I recommended to the DOJ that they should recommend to Congress, that Congress should do to reduce actual regulation and expand choice and restore people's right to make their own health decisions. One of the more important things has to do with basically the only proposal I heard J.D. Vance, and maybe either Donald Trump or J.D. Vance advanced during the campaign, which was when J.D. Vance said we should let people buy insurance that is exempt from Obamacare, that's tailored to their needs and that has lower premiums. That is what the German system makes available to residents. If you want to go outside of the compulsory government program, you can buy risk-rated health insurance that can stay with you for the rest of your life. And you get to stay in a non-government plan. So
they're doing portable benefits. So you can it's.
Well, it's not a benefit. It's a product. It's like car insurance.
No. So you buy it. So you buy it. So in the sense it has the design of you buy this product and it's not attached to your work. It's not attached to you just can take it. Right. Okay.
And there are a couple of markets in the United States where that could be possible, Congress could codify the rules that Brian mentioned, having to do with what we call short-term plans. President Trump issued a final regulation or rule in 2018 that vastly deregulated those plans and added consumer protections to them. And I gotta give kudos to Brian here because he was the driving force behind that change. Unfortunately, so Congress needed to only codify those rules in order to give people that freedom and to deregulate health insurance in the way that J.D. Vance was suggesting. Congress would need to act because, unfortunately, the Biden administration undid all the good work that Brian and others in the Trump administration did. But there are other ways that Congress can make those sorts of health plans available to people. Congress could tell states that they can't bar their residents from buying insurance from U.S. territories, which are exempt from Obamacare. The Obama administration made them exempt. Or Congress could create a new category of health insurance that's not subject to Obamacare. And if you do that, then people will be able to get health insurance at premiums that are like 60% lower than the lowest cost Obamacare premiums. That's the sort of health insurance that Brian made accessible to people when the Trump administration expanded access to and deregulated and expanded consumer protections and short-term plans. We could see the same thing in any of these markets. It requires Congress to deregulate, and they can do that without touching Obamacare. Everybody who's in Obamacare could stay there. If their premiums go up, their Obamacare subsidies would rise along with those premiums. The reason that Obamacare supporters oppose the idea that J.D. Vance put forward, the ideas that I'm talking about, is not because it would take Obamacare away, at least not directly. They oppose it because when those premiums go up and the subsidies go up, more of the cost of Obamacare would appear in the federal budget, and that would reveal just how costly Obamacare is, and they want to keep that cost hidden. They don't want people to know how expensive the law is.
Well, I suspect we could talk for another 5 hours. I mean, after all, it is the fastest growing part of our budget. But I want to thank you because this was great. And hopefully, some of your ideas will make it one way or another. The Doge will hear them, and then Congress will do something about it finally. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.